All right, if you heard that cue that this meeting is being recorded, I think we can get started. I see a good number of people here, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Daniel McNamee. I'm the director for the New York State Division for Historic Preservation. Our office is within the Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. The office is the stewards of over 250 state parks and historic sites. I think for this meeting, to give you some geography, that includes Spa Park to the north and Fort Craylow, Grafton Park to the east, Schuyler Mansion and Thatcher Park to the west, and right adjacent here is Skodak Landing to the south. So the Division for Historic Preservation is not usually what you think of when you hear state parks, but I hope that you walk away today and you find out more about what the division does. We are responsible for the interpretation, curation, and collection of 35 historic sites, but largely our function is to carry out the duties of the State Historic Preservation Office. There'll be a lot more on that in the presentation today. So we're here to talk about the division's National Register program, which we run in conjunction with the National Park Service. Specifically, we're here to talk about the Papscanee Island Historic District. The nomination is sponsored by the Stockbridge-Muncie Community Band of Mohegan Indians, and it's the division's responsibility to facilitate the nomination process with our partners at the National Park Service. You've all been invited here today because you are a stakeholder in the nomination process, either as a landowner, representative of a landowner, or for other interests. The division put the pause on a previous nomination attempt to offer further outreach to you. Hear comments from the New York State Review Board for Historic Preservation and other stakeholders, and continue to work with the sponsor of the nomination draft. Our agenda today, you're going to hear about the history of Papscanee Island. You're going to hear a word from our sponsors, so to speak, and we'll provide an overview of the National Register program and the nomination process. There's ample time today, so we're not in a rush. We will do a robust Q&A where I think is really productive time to get your questions out there. We ask that you do hold your questions till we go through our brief presentation, but by all means, please use the chat function. You can throw stuff in there now. I'll keep an eye on it as we go through these sections. We will get to every question. You heard this meeting is being recorded. This will be available on our website, and a copy of this presentation is going to be available upon request. So without further, I'd like to introduce Kathleen LaFranc, who is our lead historian working with the sponsors on this nomination. Kath is going to give you a very brief presentation about the history of Papscanee. So over to you, Kath. Kath, I think you may be on mute. Yep.
Try again. How's that? And could we have the first slide? Okay, there we go. Good afternoon, everyone. The Papscanee Island Historic District is a cultural landscape encompassing the most intact and well-documented resources within the original bounds of Papscanee Island that relate to the themes of Mohican history from the late pre-contact period, early contact with the Dutch, Dutch colonization of the Middle Hudson Valley, and the changes brought about by contact between the Mohicans and the Dutch. It is nationally significant as one of the last and most unspoiled remnants of the cultural historic landscape of the Middle Hudson Valley, documenting the culture and lifeways of the Mohicans, the Hudson Valley's predominant native people, and as the home of Papscanee, an important Mohican political leader. It is especially important for its collection of well-preserved archaeological sites and for the integrity of its ancient and largely undeveloped agricultural setting. This nomination proposes significance at two levels, national and state, and under all four National Register criteria, A, B, C, and D, in the areas of ethnic heritage, Native American, politics, government, archaeology, settlement, and architecture. At the time of European contact, Mohicans had been living in the Hudson River Valley for countless generations. This map shows the Mohican territory in the early 17th century. The large collection of pre-contact and post-contact archaeological sites within the district has a potential to yield substantial and important information about Mohican lifeways. their culture as a sovereign nation prior to the colonial period, their settlement patterns, subsistence systems, political and social organization, maize agriculture, and the social and organizational changes associated with their early contact with Europeans. The sites associated with Papscanee, an important historical figure, present an opportunity to study historical events and social, political, ethnic dynamics that affected the broad patterns of colonialization in New York and the experiences of Native Americans and Europeans during this formative period in New York's history. This 1760 map gives you an idea of the profound transformation of the Mid-Hudson Valley landscape after the Dutch settled Fort Orange in 1624. Rensselaerwyck, which is imprinted over the island, is the million-acre tract that Kilian Van Rensselaer acquired beginning in 1631. He purchased land on and around Papscanee from the influential Mohican Sachem Papscanee and from his heirs. Now, just above the words Old Anchorage was the Overslaw, the sandbar where the Dutch ships waited for the tide to come in before they could move on to Fort Orange. And from here, the Dutch could see the luscious, flat, and fertile island, how it had already been cleared for cultivation by the Mohicans, and how it was ready for planting the wheat that they had been sent here to grow. Their presence was also advantageous for the Mohicans, who were interested in trade with the Europeans, beginning with the all-important fur trade. Van Rensselaer's agents bought the island from Papscanee's heirs in 1637, and at least 6 Van Rensselaer farms were established there immediately. The archaeological sites of some of these farms may be among the earliest European farm sites in New York. One early New World Dutch farmhouse survives, the Jochum Stats House. The Stats family acquired their land from the Van Rensselaers in 1696. The house was built in 3 parts between 1700 and the 1880s. The stone section has a traditional Dutch framing system, but it also has a center hall dividing the main rooms on the parlor floor. And in this, it reflects both the persistence of Dutch culture after the English took over New York and the wealth and status of this particular family. The Stats family cemetery contains burials from 1707 to 2022. The house and cemetery still remain in the Stats family after 3 centuries. Beginning with Dutch settlement, this land was almost certainly farmed by the enslaved Africans the Dutch brought with them. The 1790 census documents between 8 and 14 enslaved Africans on each of 4 different island farms, among them the Stats farm. That is a significant number of enslaved Africans per farm, and it indicates the considerable wealth and status of these Dutch farmers and their place in the global economy of the Netherlands. After the Dutch arrived, however, the Mohican presence on the island gradually diminished until they had mostly disappeared by the late 17th century. Today, more than 2/3 of the island is still farmed, and it is some of the oldest continuously farmed land in New York State. Scholars believe that it looks much as it did to the Dutch and to the Mohicans before them. The Stockbridge Munsees own 1/3 of the land, and over 80% of it remains undeveloped. This is Bonnie Hartley, the Tribal Preservation Manager for the Stockbridge Munsee, and Sherry White, the Tribal Council Liaison. For the contemporary Mohican people, Papscanee Island exemplifies their persistent and ongoing connection to their traditional homeland. They consider it to be a resource of the utmost historic, spiritual, and cultural significance. The Stockbridge Munsees are the sponsor of the nomination, and now Jeff Brendamere, their Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, is going to speak about the nomination on their behalf. Jeff?
Hi, I hope you can hear me. My name's Jeff Bendramer, and I am the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Stockbridge Munsee community. Thank you very much for having me here today. I am the sponsor of, I guess, this nomination. I'm the also the author of the nomination. We've been working on this for the last 2.5 years approximately, working under an underrepresented communities grant from the National Park Service. I want to do 3 things, and I'll try to be as brief as I can. I'm going to read a very short passage from the nomination. I'm going to read 5 quotes from contemporary Mohican tribal members, and then I'm going to read a brief passage, my own, I guess you could say my own message today to you. So I'll begin right now. All too often, the voices and stories of Indigenous people have been given little attention, overshadowed by narratives centering European colonists and their descendants. Most American history books begin with the arrival of European explorers or the founding of early colonies like Roanoke, Jamestown, or Plymouth. These narratives often cast Indigenous peoples as background characters, or worse yet, obstacles for the colonists to overcome. These descriptions tend to be so devoid of context, they amount to caricatures or inaccurate stereotypes. The reasons for these dynamics are many, ranging from deliberate attempts to downplay the accomplishments of Native people by settlers seeking to occupy traditional homelands, to the fact that historians often privilege the written record over oral tradition, which inevitably disadvantages Native American narratives. For these reasons, accurate and detailed information about Indigenous peoples and their past is sorely missing from our current understanding of American history. It is our contention that Papscanee Island and its associated ethnohistoric and archaeological data are an exceedingly rare instance of unbroken continuity from Indigenous settlement, earliest European contact, through colonial occupation. Although these historic resources represent critical sources of knowledge about the story of a particular underrepresented community, the history of the Mohicans exemplifies an often invisible Indigenous cultural heritage, which constitutes a key component of our national past. The contemporary Mohican people consider Papscanee Island to be a historic resource of utmost historic, spiritual, and cultural significance, based on its association with events that are significant to Mohican history, its direct association with the sachem Papscanee, and for its importance as a place of traditional ceremonies, for its connection to Mohican ancestors, and as one of many important historic sites in the Mohican traditional homeland. So I hope that tells you a little bit of why the nomination exists. These are 5 quotes from contemporary tribal members talking about the meaning of Papscanee Island to them. The first one is as follows. This is necessary and beautiful work. Our people have suffered too long in the absence of our history and culture. The protection of our sites back east is helping to heal our people. There is medicine in this work. We have all the tools and resources within our culture, and this protection continues to uncover and recover what was taken from us in a good way. I am so thankful for this. That's the first quote. The second quote, every time I visit our homelands, I feel a sense of belonging and at the same time a sense of grief because the land hasn't been cared for and we, our history, our presence are not visible. It is good to know that that is slowly changing. Another quote, The connection is still present generations later. Anyone I talk to who's been to our homeland states pretty much the same thing, home. They have this calm and relaxing feeling along with sadness. Sometimes they feel they are not walking alone when they are in the area. Another quote, I have walked this island and studied the history of my tribe on this island. Since our sachem lived there, it is like our current tribal office. I love that. Our tribe's business was conducted there by the sachem. He was the keeper of the wampum belts and strings. We have burials in place to this day. You can walk some of the fields and find our pottery and artifacts lying about. Some of the oldest cornfields are still being used. And the last quote, having the opportunity to stand on the island and offer a prayer for the ones who walked before us in our original homeland was beyond amazing. As we prayed, again the eagles came, like in the other experience I shared. 2 eagles circled until we were done with our prayer and tobacco offering. What I have been taught is that those eagles are the messengers who carry those prayers and energy to and from the spirits. So I hope that having a little exposure to the perspective of the tribal members is helpful to understand how this nomination came about. And this last part is from me, and it's maybe these are sentiments, my own feelings about it. Maybe, but that couldn't be put into the nomination itself. But I hope it makes an impression on you today. The state has found Papscanee Island eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. And the island meets a variety of structured criteria for listing like significance, integrity, feel, etc. However, the Stockbridge-Munsee community undertook this nomination for very different reasons. The tribe has its own story to tell. It's a story that's largely unknown. It's not a story of archaeology, science, or archival research. It's a narrative based in a love for their homeland that they were forced to leave. Its waters, hills, forests, and farms are their heritage. It's based on a love for their ancestors. They are the source of faith, tradition, knowledge, and they literally reside in this land. Finally, the world we live in today, in so many ways, is the result of Native American heritage in big and small ways you may not be aware of. The cornflakes you ate this morning, maybe the name of your town or the stream near your house. The animals you call skunk or moose are the animals they called skunk and moose. And land you live on and the water you drink were once theirs. And the love of this land isn't unique to the Stockbridge-Munsee. You love this land too. You may farm it like they did. You may make your living there like they did. You may depend on this land like they did 400 years ago. But this nomination doesn't take anything away from you. It only adds the Stockbridge-Munsee's voice to yours. It adds their story to yours in a place of importance to all of us. History, especially one that has been essentially hidden, is a gift for the entire community and our descendants. I would hope for your support as we add the Mohican story to the record. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeff. We really appreciate that. Next up, we're going to hear from Kathy Howe, who is our Bureau Director of Community Preservation here at the division. Kathy's going to give you an overview of the National Register program and some next steps, how we evaluated it, and how we'll be moving this forward for a potential review. So, Kathy.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go over, these are some of the things I'm going to address today. What are the federal and state historic preservation laws? What is the National Register? What does it do or not do? And what is the difference between eligibility and listing? Next slide. So beginning with this, before I get into the specifics of the proposed state and national registers listing today and what it means to property owners, I want to give everyone an overview of federal and state historic preservation laws and what they mean specifically within the context of Papscanee Island. Next slide. So one of the State Historic Preservation Office, as we're known, also the Division for Historic Preservation, one of our primary responsibilities under these laws, which I'll talk about, is to identify, evaluate, register, and protect historic and cultural resources. Next slide. The National Historic Preservation Act was signed into law in 1966 by President Johnson. And by the way, there's a lot of words on these slides. I'm not going to repeat everything verbatim. We're happy to share this PowerPoint for anyone that's interested, if you just let us know. So next slide. So under the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, it established, among other things, state historic preservation offices in all states. It created the National Register of Historic Places. And under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, it established a review process for federally funded, permitted, and licensed projects. Next slide. Of course, here at the state level, we have our own parallel State Historic Preservation Act enacted in 1980, which largely parallels the federal law in spirit. Next slide. The State Historic Preservation Act established the State Register of Historic Places, which actually uses the exact same criteria as the National Register. It also established Section 1409 of the law, which created a review process for state-funded, permitted, or licensed projects. Next. So under these laws, state and federal agencies that are funding, licensing, or approving projects must consult with our agency, with the State Historic Preservation Office, to first of all determine if there are any historic or cultural resources that might be impacted by a proposed activity, such as new construction. And this review ensures that properties that are listed or eligible for listing on the registers are considered and adverse impacts are avoided or mitigated during the project planning process. Next. So, basic fact here, for compliance reviews under these laws, no distinction, I just want to be clear, no distinction is made between properties that have been determined eligible versus those that are listed. Equal consideration and weight is given to eligible or listed projects. Next. So by way of a little background, so Papscanee Island was determined eligible way back in 2009, and it's been eligible now, 14 years. So it was determined eligible at that time as part of a Section 106 review for the proposed Empire Rail Corridor project. I believe this was the proposal related to high-speed rail across the state. Included within this eligibility was the previously NR listed Stats House and Cemetery. The 2009 determination, as I said, was the result of cooperation between both our agency and the Stockbridge-Muncie Nation's review of this FHWA project. Sherry White, who was the nation's tribal historic preservation officer at the time, was highly concerned that the setting of Papscanee Island would be negatively impacted by this large-scale corridor and bridge project. And also, I want to say that well before our determination of 2009, our agency was very familiar with the significance of Papscanee Island. Our former historic sites archaeologist, Paul Huey, has spent a lifetime identifying Indigenous and Dutch archaeological sites on the island, and his research goes back at least until the late 1960s. I also want to say that in addition to our review in 2009 of the Empire Rail Corridor, our office has reviewed other state and federally funded and permitted projects on the island, such as the Consolidated Natural Gas Underground Pipeline, the East Greenbush Marina New Construction Project, the National Grid Pipeline Transmission Project, and Green Renewable Ink Manufacturing Facility. So let's go to the next. What criteria were used to determine that Papscanee Island is eligible? Well, like all state historic preservation offices, we use the well-established National Register criteria for evaluation. These are found in the Code of Federal Regulations. And the criteria helps us to determine what qualifies to be eligible for listing. A property must meet at least one criteria and must retain historic integrity of the features that convey the significance. Next, please. So here are the criteria. Earlier in the talk today, Kath went over the criteria A, B, C, and D, which under the proposed National Register nomination, she has mentioned it meets all 4 of those criteria. Next. And in the determination of eligibility of 2009, it identified A, B, and D. And of course, it being significant largely for its association with the Native people, the Mohicans. Next. Now, jumping forward, and Jeff has mentioned this, in 2021, the nation received an underrepresented communities grant from the National Park Service for Papscanee Island. Currently, part of the terms of their contract with the Park Service is the completion of a successful National Register nomination for the eligible historic district. Moving forward to our next slide. So the Mohican Nation of the Stockbridge-Muncie Band is the official sponsor of this nomination, and it is scheduled to be presented at the September 7th meeting of the State Review Board for Historic Preservation. Next, please. The state and national registers of historic places are the official lists of properties that are significant in local, state, and or national history. Next, please. So as property owners, you might want to know, well, what are the benefits of being listed on the registers? First and foremost, and Jeff spoke so eloquently about this earlier, as did Kath, this is official recognition that the island is significant. Listing is largely honorific. Also, it does provide eligibility for state homeowner tax credits and state or federal commercial historic rehab tax credits. I'm simply mentioning this. Actually, only buildings are eligible for this, so it's other than the one building they're not that applicable to in this case. Eligibility, it opens up the door to eligibility for nonprofits and municipalities to apply for state historic preservation matching grants under the Environmental Protection Fund. Next, please. So some frequently asked questions that we typically get from property owners in proposed districts. Do you have to open your property, either your building, or do you have to provide public access to your land? The answer is absolutely not. There is no requirement to open your property or your land to the public. Will listing on the registers affect my local property taxes or zoning? The answer clear is no. There's no direct bearing on any of these local actions. Also, is the listing of the property going to restrict my use of my property? The answer there, quite simply, is no. It does not restrict the use or disposition of your property or obligate any private property owners in any way, so long as you are not using federal or state funds to do an action, to complete a project, and so long as you do not require a state or federal permit. You are free to do as you please with your property, of course, within compliance with local zoning, which has nothing to do with state or national register. Moving on. Another question, a few other questions that we get, one in particular: can an owner object to having his property listed on the registers? And the answer is yes. In this case, for properties with multiple owners, such as a historic district, objections only count toward the listing of the district as a whole. So no one owner can exempt himself from listing of in the district by means of an objection. And if the majority of property owners in the district object, the district cannot, by law, be listed on the National Register. I do want to say, if you have already sent us a letter of objection, then you do not need to send us a new one. We already have that on file. However, after perhaps learning more about the process and what it means and doesn't mean, should you wish to rescind your previous objection letter, please send us a letter stating that fact, or feel free to supply us with a letter of support. I want to say that although the state register does not recognize owner objection, unlike National Register, it is the policy of our agency to work with owners to provide information and education about the register's program, which is what we're doing today. The decision to proceed with a state register listing, but not the National Register listing, is made on a case-by-case basis. And regardless, be clear that the 2009 determination of eligibility remains in place to inform future Section 106 and Section 1409 project planning. And let's go to our next steps. The nomination sponsor is currently revising the nomination based on comments received from the New York State Board for Historic Preservation at their last meeting. And the revised draft will be available from the SHPO by August 7th, which is the 30 days point prior to the State Review Board meeting. Feel free to contact us for a copy of the nomination. And again, the board will be it's scheduled to review this nomination at its September 7th meeting. This meeting is open to the public, either via WebEx, such as like today, or should you wish, in person. The meeting will be held at Phillips Manor Hall State Historic Site down in Yonkers. And if the board recommends the nomination, the New York State Historic Preservation Officer will can choose to list the property on the state register, and then would forward it on to the National Park Service for review and listing consideration on the National Register. And last slide for me. And so that said, you've got, if you have questions, if you want to receive the draft nomination, here is the contact information. Contact Kathleen LaFranc, There's the information there via email, and she will be happy to answer questions and to provide you with a copy of that nomination draft. Thank you. Dan?
Thank you, Kathy. I appreciate that. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a good time to open the floodgates to your questions to us. So please enter them in the chat. You can raise your hand while people are typing a little bit. I'm going to say, just a reminder of some things. It was 2009, 14 years ago, when Papscanee was determined eligible for the register. Obviously, many people know it has been studied since the late 1960s, all through the 70s. So very, very well known, particularly archaeological site in New York State. We got to hear from the Stockbridge Muncie community. Thank you so much, Jeff. And just so you know, it was their application to the National Park Service grant program that motivates this nomination. I want to emphasize again, in the biggest way, I think so much of Kathy and Kathleen's job we are constantly telling people the nomination to the registers is honorific. That is the honorific part. So just want you to always keep in mind the difference between eligibility and listing. There is no further regulatory role during this, but I hope you walked away today learning what that regulatory role really is. So again, Kathy's giving you some of the important milestones in this. We've got a September 7th date, so go back 30 days. By law, we will make sure that the nomination is posted on our website. You will also be able to get a copy of this nomination. Letters to those property owners in the eligible catchment area who are proposed to be listed. Letters will also go out by August 7th, so you'll receive notification then. So this is our process. I mean, I hope you are comfortable with it. None of you are putting questions in the chat though. So any questions or show of hands? Yes, Teresa, I've got my colleague Chelsea here. She'll make sure that you're off mute and you can ask a question.
Great. I don't know if you can hear me or not.
We can hear you.
Oh, okay, great, great. So when I read through the nomination, it looked like the original eligibility determination was made with respect to the 26 acres, 26.07, I believe it said. It looks like this nomination covers 613.46 acres. So it seems substantially larger than the previous occurrence back in 2009.
Yes.
I represent Sprague. My name is Teresa Baker, and I'm with Whiteman, Oshman, and Hanna. Sprague is one of the longtime owners and occupiers of this area, which is zoned industrial. And in our objection letter, we sent a aerial photograph showing where we are in the landscape. I noticed that the pictures that you all had were very bucolic. There is a part of this that's been nominated, which is very industrial. And so I guess in light of the fact that you're seeking to establish a historic district and it covers many, many acres, has any thought been given to excluding properties which have very large terminal tanks and a very large commitment, to continuing to exist at that location? Sprague's been there since almost immediately post World War II. And it's not clear, there may have been industrial activities there before, but we included the aerial photo so you could see that at the time the tanks were installed, the entire area was regraded, of course, for making sure that you had the appropriate shape for containment and everything. And so I know this is a really long question and I apologize for that. But we we feel we're non-contributing and we would really like to be excluded, and you have lots of acres there, so it's not clear to us why we're included.
Okay, so I will start with the difference between an eligibility and a National Register listing. An eligibility is always like a quick pass for us. I mean, this office is doing tens of thousands of reviews at any time. So that's really our first gathering of information. It's a lot of times what comes in from say, this was a rail project, they submitted stuff, our historians expand on that. It's really when we get to a nomination that boundaries grow pretty significantly. Now, I will say, in recognizing the heavily industrial portion, I think a good thing that happened by taking a pause from this is we got to present to our state review board, who subsequently made comments on the nomination boundaries and areas of national significance, state significance, and we went right back with the sponsors. Now, I will say at this time, we will have the official boundaries drawn by August 7th. So I recommend, if you're outside of that boundary by August 7th, you will not receive a letter. So really stay in touch with us. Kath is the point of contact there. You will see a potentially revised boundary. We really cut it to the end of right up to this meeting. It's summer, so everybody's out half the time. But yes, we did recognize the heavy industrial areas. I would expect that if there was any, removal from the nomination, that would not be removal from eligibility. Eligibility, very often, particularly with archaeology, requires substantive testing and research questions. So if portions of the northern boundary fall off, they fall out of this nomination process, but not potentially out of eligibility.
Yeah, from my perspective as an environmental attorney, there is a difference between being part of a historic district that's listed on the National Register and being near to sites which are eligible for listing or part of a historic district, because as soon as you need a stormwater permit, an air permit, a speedies permit, a bulk storage permit, or a permit reissuance, this becomes a big issue as part of the review of the project. So that's one of the reasons why specifically we've been asked to be, removed from the historic district itself.
Sure. Well, I do want to say, just specifically, my area is also preservation policy. When I say remained eligible, again, you have been eligible since 2009. If you were to be removed from the nomination process, it would not necessarily remove eligibility. The nomination process, again, is the honorific part. There's no change in regulation. But I would expect that, the big thing is, just to clarify for other property owners here, there's no change in the regulatory status. So the regulatory experience that your owners have experienced in the same 14 years continues on. And you are correct that there are storm runoffs, but also, sites on the Hudson River, we're talking Army Corps of Engineers. It's not just preservation. These are regulated sites, and we are in New York State. So there's a level there, but I do just want to really confirm the difference between listed and eligible.
I hear you. I have participated in reviews where things were eligible and things were listed. I think the point we just want to make is that the currently used industrially zoned portion that we have on the one tip, and I won't say northern or southern because I'm terrible with directions, I apologize. But with respect to our site and its current use, we don't feel we contribute. And therefore, we're requesting not only that we be identified as a non-contributing part of the historic district, but that we just be excluded from the historic district, understanding that the property still would fall under the category of eligible. That's not anything that anyone can do anything about.
Right. Well, I thank you. And yes, you've reiterated the letter, which I appreciate. And just let you know, a letter of objection, support, rescinding, it is part of the permanent record. And so we appreciate that. So to keep the process public and open.
Thanks.
All right, additional questions. You may have to put your hand up with the hand function so we can take you off of mute. All right, this is a pretty quiet group.
Dan, I had my hand up. I don't know if you can hear me.
Oh, yep, I can see you, Beth. I'm
So-
sorry. I must not be able to see, but if you're able to unmute or start talking, go right ahead. Jump
Okay,
in.
great. Yeah, just some of the things that have been talked about already. You mentioned revisions were being made to the nomination, the draft nomination. In those revisions, and I don't know if you can speak to this at this point because I know everybody's doing everything right up to the wire, but will the non-contributing parcels be identified and under which criteria, if any, they are not contributing? Because the district, you know, is being nominated under all four, and some of them, so for example, under criteria C, which is for all of the Dutch architecture and historic architecture, that may not apply to all parcels because they may not have a building on them or something. So is there going to be any identification to sort of distinguish what are contributing to, you know, what parcels may contribute to which criteria? I'm not sure how that really plays out when you have a district that has all four criteria.
Yeah, no, I mean, I will say, yes, we usually break these down, like you said, just so everybody on the call knows. Non-contributing sometimes is, you know, a modern building or pathway or something like that. We do actually say what is contributing and non-contributing. We identify, you know, resource types, if they are under, you know, C for national significance, which is architecture. We are one building there, it's already listed. Or archaeology sites under blah, blah, blah. We do it that way. In terms of the actual resource count, identifying it each one as A, B, and C, and D, I think we really could do that. It's not typical for a nomination to do that, but I think it's interesting, especially because it's complex with the different levels. So the comment's good. We can work on that. I mean, also remember this nomination, it stays in draft even after the state review board meeting. So I kind of like the idea because it's complicated, but I can't guarantee that that's how we've currently broken it up.
Right. It's just, you know, I understand that, you know, with respect to criteria B, you know, as it being a heritage location for the Stockbridge-Muncie community, you know, that sort of applies to the general area, but some of those other criteria don't apply to each and every single parcel. And I know that because I'm on the side where I'm always reaching out to the SHPO for project reviews, knowing which project is going to have an impact on which criteria, I think is important as the project moves forward. To put that in there, and you know, whether or not it's archaeology or it's architecture, or you have to worry about indirect impacts. I think those are, or in what way you look at indirect impacts. I think it would be important to have some of that information laid out.
Yeah, I like it. It's interesting. It's a little different than all of the nominations, but I see Jeff is raising his hand. Jeff, did you have a comment on that?
I did. Hi, Beth.
Hi, Jeff.
I just want, as the author, I'm a little daunted by your suggestion in the following sense. You know, Papscanee Island is a historic entity. You know, it means something to, in our case, Mohican ancestors. It's an entity that they would recognize, whereas the properties are more of a modern delineation or a modern phenomenon. And so, you know, you may have, for example, the Van Buren farm, which a particular site, important Dutch site that was established in 1637. It's hard to know where exactly that farm, and there was a structure, a domestic structure, of course, there, But where the farm sort of ranged within the manor of Rensselaerwick would be a very difficult delineation to make.
Sure.
So I'm a little, as I say, I'm a little daunted by the prospect of trying to make those kinds of calls.
Right, and I think my question / suggestion was more along the lines of some of those more industrialized properties that have created a substantial amount of disturbance, either above ground or below ground, to just be identified as such. I recognize that a Dutch farmstead is going to meet at least 3, if not all 4 of those criteria. But to just identify which ones, it might be simpler in this instance, given the size of the parcel of the nomination parcels, to look at which ones wouldn't meet, particular criteria, and identify those as not contributing under those specific criteria, rather than trying to say that each and every part, identify that, parcel A meets 1 through 3 and parcel B is, all 4. I would agree that would be daunting.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
would be overwhelming.
Yeah. I will say, I could see it as something we could consider for the resource count, but remember, a nomination this is the nomination process. So that's about, you're talking parcels. We don't nominate by defining parcels because parcel boundaries change over time. This is looking at it as a whole. I think maybe we could identify it under the resource count, but we would not say this parcel's this parcel's this, because these parcels fuse and change and stuff like that. The National Register program isn't going to look at that, but the ownership, I think you have an interesting idea for sure.
Okay.
And I think it could benefit the nomination in the long run.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna mute myself because the thunderstorm's probably
Oh.
carry through.
Yeah, and Teresa, you still have your hand up.
I apologize. I did not mean to.
That's okay. All right. Somebody else has a question. Daniel McKay, you have your hand up?
I do. Let me go on camera here. There we go. So good afternoon. This is Daniel McKay. I serve as Deputy Commissioner for Historic Preservation for New York State Parks. I oversee the work of the Division for Historic Preservation. And I want to thank the staff for putting together what I hope is perceived as a very clean, crisp, direct, and focused presentation on this nomination. One thing that caught my ear, and I understand why questions are focused in this general direction. The revised nomination will be available, date certain, August 7th. And one thing that was said by park staff earlier is, if, for example, the revised nomination presents a redefinition, a redesignation of the boundary, and certain properties going forward as of August 7th draft are excluded or no longer included in the proposed nomination, that in effect you will not receive direct communication from our office about that. I think it would serve, I just want to say, I think from my perspective, it would serve a continuation of direct, forthright correspondence here for our staff to indicate, the process would continue. The notification process would continue for those who might be within a potential revised boundary. But I want to make a commitment that we will communicate with the parties who've been part of the process since May, even if you are potentially, even if your property potentially is no longer in the proposed district, that you will receive direct correspondence from our office regarding that, so that there's no uncertainty. I know there's been issues with addresses, communication with one office as opposed to another, one address as opposed to the preferred address. I just want to make sure that we are communicating who the revised nomination applies to and to whom it does not. So I'll just make that commitment that we will be in communication with everyone who's been part of the process to date, even if you may not be part of the process going forward. So I appreciate that. I do want to encourage the multiple parties on this call to please, this is, certainly a very appropriate time to ask questions. If you want to process, review, discuss this presentation, please be in touch with Kathleen LaFranc with follow-up questions as quickly as you're able, because we would like to be as responsive and timely in responses, to the maximum extent possible. So please don't hesitate to ask. Please don't hesitate to participate in Thursday's meeting as well. So that's it for me.
Thanks, Daniel. I see Doug Pirelli has his hand up. Doug?
Yeah, following up on what Daniel just said, if the boundary were to be modified and parcels, the industrial parcels were to be outside of the district boundary, would that remove the letters of objection from consideration for those parcels?
Yes, it would.
And the authors of the letters of objection would not have to specifically rescind the letters or offer a letter of support, although it would be awesome if they did.
They would not be required to rescind their letters, but it would not count towards the property owner count. Okay. Beth, you had another question?
Just to follow up to Doug's comment on if the boundary of the nomination for the listed property changes, does that alter the eligibility boundary that was previously identified, or
No.
that
No.
still holds?
That still holds. We will be issuing after a new eligibility because, as Teresa had pointed out earlier, the eligibility itself is now kind of getting a little long in the tooth. So we will update the eligibility as well.
Okay. Yeah, I just wasn't sure about that process. Thank you.
All right. Looking for more questions. And with that, the group has gone silent. I do want to encourage you, please feel free to reach out to our office. Jeff, you had a question?
Yes, if I may, if we're getting close to wrapping up, I just wanted to say how grateful that I am and the Stockbridge-Muncie community is to the State Historic Preservation Office and for all the guidance and that we've received and the professional help that we've gotten in the course of our writing and submitting this nomination. And I just want to say too, for other folks who are on the call, we're your neighbor. We're property owners there on Papscanee Island, and we value being good neighbors. We're as you know, we own that property, but we do make it accessible to the public for their enjoyment and for the nature of the place and preserving it. And we are trying to be as conscientious as we can, as good neighbors and good stewards of the land. Obviously for many reasons, including the Mohican ancestors, but also for our current neighbors. And in general, for the folks there in Schodack and East Greenbush, who hopefully enjoy the nature preserve and that access to a pristine banks of the Hudson River, and all of that kind of thing. So just thank you for Daniel, for you, your staff, and also for our neighbors. I hope that you would be able to support us either overtly or perhaps reconsider your objections. We are not trying to take anything away from you or from the town or any of the landowners. We're simply trying to tell the Stockbridge Muncie story and add it to the record, and be good stewards of that land. Thank you.
Jeff, thank you very much. With that, I'm going to conclude the meeting today. I appreciate everybody joining us. I do recommend following August 7th that you do read the nomination. I think truly believe Papscanee is a very, very special place, and the nomination is a thoroughly interesting read. So whether you're a lover of history or not, I think you'll find something very interesting reading the nomination. So please check it out. Please reach out to the office. We're grateful you could join us today. We will be having another meeting, which is duplicating the same information today. So if you signed up for that one and you're not going to attend, let us know. But we'll be doing this again. So appreciate everybody. Thank you very much. This presentation will be available. Bye-bye.